Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to join me in marking the publication of my book. People have really come from all over today, and there are people here from LA and Boston and New York and New Jersey, people I've known a really long time, people I've met more recently. Some of you I'm meeting for the first time today, and I just really want to thank you profoundly for coming to join me today. I hope it will be a fun and celebratory day for us all, but it is a serious topic, so I'm aware of a kind of balance between those things, and it's very meaningful to have so many people with me today. Before I say a few words about the book itself and the plan for today, I want to thank the people and institutions who made the event possible. So thanks to the BMA for hosting it, and in particular to Robin Joyce, who's the Assistant Curator of Academic Engagement, for working with me on it, and Natasha Water, who's behind the scenes doing all the IT today. Thanks to Sig Libowitz, Marley Hernandez-Cortez, Stephen Schuyler, Chelsea Duravel, Andrew Robinson, Ben Schultz, and Amma Prosiak for doing the filming today. Thanks to Johns Hopkins, especially the deans at the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, the William H. Miller Department of Philosophy, and the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute for sponsoring it. And thanks most of all to Quinn Broussard and Danielle Stout, our administrators in the philosophy department. They've both been absolutely incredible, not only for their professional attention to 1,000,001 details. We've been joking that today's a bit like putting on a wedding, and they were the wedding organizers, but also for their enthusiasm for some of the more quirky parts of the day. And in particular, Danielle went so far as to make by hand the chocolate rat pops that are sitting over there, and which I hope everyone will have at some point. They're, your snack for the movie that we're going to watch later today. So this was really beyond the call and such a lovely thing to do. So thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Quinn, as well. Unfortunately, Quinn can't be with us today. Okay, so I guess the first question is, what would you all do alone in a cage with nothing but cocaine? I thought I should begin by explaining why I chose this title. And the reasons are twofold. At the book's heart is really the idea that understanding addiction isn't only a scientific project, but also a humanistic and imaginative endeavor. And so I directly address you, whether that's the reader of the book or the audience here and now, at various points in the book, in thinking about addiction, here with you now, to really sort of invite that participation in the endeavor. So the title is kind of deliberately provocative in throwing down that sort of humanistic, imaginative gauntlet from the very start. But it also alludes to an important scientific experiment from the early days of animal models of addiction. So let me tell you a little bit about that experiment. So in 1985, Michael Bozarth and Roy Wise trained rats to press a lever to get a dose of cocaine, and the rats were then permanently housed in an experimental chamber containing only food, water, and the lever that they could press for as much cocaine as they wanted. So in other words, the rats were effectively alone in a cage with nothing but cocaine. So I don't think anyone, whether you've read the book yet or not, will be surprised to learn that the rats in this experiment took an awful lot of cocaine. And because cocaine suppresses hunger and thirst, they also stopped eating and drinking. And within a month, 90% of them had died. And I love thinking about this experiment because it's such a beautiful illustration of the currently dominant scientific paradigm of addiction, which is, of course, the brain disease model of compulsion. So suppose you ask, why would any animal abandon itself to cocaine at the expense of food and water? Well, the answer offered by the brain disease model is that it's the power of drugs to hijack the brain and compel use. And this really is a simple, elegant explanation of why the rats in this experiment pressed the lever for cocaine to the point of death. But the irony is that the brain disease model of compulsion remains the dominant paradigm of addiction, even though subsequent experiments with rats have shown that this is not the correct explanation. So forget about the rats for a moment and ask yourself what you would do. I mean, really, what would you do if you were alone in a cage with nothing but cocaine? And why would you do it? So for many of us, if we're honest, the answer we'd give to that question is that we take a lot of cocaine. And that's because we imagine being trapped in isolation and emptiness. We imagine the boredom, the loneliness, the frustration, and the suffering. And we recognize that in that context, there's one and only one thing that offers any relief, and that's cocaine. So we have here an alternative hypothesis generated by imagining honestly what you would do alone in a cage with nothing but cocaine. And the hypothesis is that it's not the power of drugs to compel use that made the rats in the early experiment press the lever to the point of death. It's the fact that they were alone in a cage with nothing but cocaine, right? So it's the barrenness of their environment and the impact of that barrenness on their psychological state that explains their behavior. Now, this alternative hypothesis is what subsequent experiments with rats in effect tested. So the experimental chamber now contains not just one lever, but two, giving the rats a choice. And the first set of studies was conducted by Serge Ahmed, who unfortunately can't be here today. And the choice was between a dose of cocaine and a drink of sweet water. And incredibly, 90% of the rats in his studies chose the sweet water, even when they showed every indication of addiction. Then, in an adaptation of Serge Ahmed's design, Marco Venniro and David Epstein, both of whom are on stage, and Yavin Shaham, who I can't see right now in the audience because it's dark for me, but you can potentially see if he puts his hand up, replace the sweet water with social reward. And that was simply a minute of playtime with another rat. And Marco, David's, and Yavin's finding was even more astounding. So virtually 100% of the rats chose the social reward, even when they showed every indication of addiction. So the title symbolizes the integration of a scientific and humanistic orientation by alluding both to the imaginative challenge of the book that I make to readers and also the history of animals, which I tell in the book. And this integration is really at the book's heart, and it's the foundation of the new paradigm that I develop in it. And I really wanted today's events to reflect it as well. So over the course of the afternoon, we'll be moving, as does the book, from science to poetry to art in the form of film, and then back to philosophy again. And although I'm not entirely sure what Kieran has in store for us, we may even end up in the clinic, I think, at the end. So, with no further delay, I want to get started with the scientific bit of the day, or the more scientific bit of the day, and introduce the panelists to you. So each of the people on the stage with me, can you see them? I'm not really sure whether the lights are sufficient. Great, let's get the lights. Each of the people on the stage is an important figure in the book and also in my life. I've learned a huge amount from them all. So I've already mentioned Marco Venniro. He's the one at your far right, and his amazing social reward studies. Marco is Associate Professor of Neurobiology and Psychiatry at the University of Maryland, and the most recent recipient of the prestigious Jacob P. Waletsky Award from the Society of Neuroscience. Okay, so Marco is also, if you haven't seen it, the illustrator of my book and has a sideline as a rat addiction artist. So you will be seeing some incredible pictures of rats and addiction on the screen behind the panel today, all of which are Marco's. Yael Niv, next to Marco, is Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Princeton University, Director of the Conte Center on Latent Cause Inference in Mental Health, and recipient of the prestigious I have to get this right, Yael, hang on. Let me turn the page. Troland Research Award from the National Academy of Sciences. So Yael studies the computational processes underlying reinforcement learning and decision-making and their relevance to mental health and treatment. And Yael is also highly unique in somehow managing to pull off the trick of being an absolutely brilliant neuroscientist and an absolutely brilliant neuroscience critic. So Owen Flanagan, next to Yael, is the James B. Duke University Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and Neurobiology at Duke University, and he's also now Professor of Philosophy at NYU Abu Dhabi. He is a pioneer of scientifically engaged philosophy of mind and the author of no less than 14 books, having just finished my first. I don't know how he has done this. Most recently, the wonderful and also wonderfully titled, What It's Like to Be an Addict. So I like to think of Owen's book as a kind of older sibling to mine, and if you haven't read it, I can't recommend it highly enough. David Epstein, right here, is the David Epstein is chief of the Real World Assessment, Prediction and Treatment section at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. David's work on addiction is really exceptional for its theoretical innovation, but also its practical significance. And he's also a leading champion of the heterogeneity of addiction, which is a core characteristic of the new paradigm that I develop in the book. And for those of us who work in the field, I think the way we would describe David is that he's the person you ask if you want to know something and you can't figure it out yourself, because David will be able to. Okay, so the panelists and I have identified 4 broad questions for discussion, and the way things are going to work is that I'll ask a question and ask one of them to take a lead in answering it before there's a general discussion. There's also a mic on the floor, it's over there, and we really would love you guys to ask questions at any point. I will try to keep my eye out for anyone lining up behind the mic and also pause, time permitting, between topics to just invite questions and see if anyone wants to ask anything. So please do ask. If you have anything, just try to be succinct. And I'm going to go join the panel and begin with our first topic. Okay, so I hope it's clear from those introductory remarks that animal models can both distort but also improve and indeed sharpen our understanding of addiction, even though there are obviously huge differences between rats and other subjects of animal research and humans, even if there are some similarities. So the topic of the panel is what we can and can't learn from animal models, and it seems apt to start with the question, which is simply, how can we design experiments, given these limitations, given both the similarities and the differences, to be maximally relevant to human addiction? And so, Marco, I'd like you to start us off on this question.
How much time we have, because we can talk about this for 2 days or
You've got 10 minutes. Go.
Okay, 10 minutes. Well, thank you so much for the introductions. Very nice. I think there are 3 points that I want to use to address your question. The first one is, in order to create different animal models or animal models that are relevant to human addiction, I think the first step will be to be exposed to somebody like you, because without opening your mind on something that is different, that is not the usual dogma or the usual animal model of addiction, you cannot explore something in our rats. So the idea, your idea of psychosocial model of addiction, this help us to identify things that we were not thinking for our animals. The second aspect is most likely you want to use something that is evolutionary conserved, something that is very naturalistic for our rats. Because when you start to implement those in the classical animal models, then you are getting closer and closer to the human issues, let's say, because then you can kind of easily, quote unquote, easily translate this behavior towards the human condition. And this is what we have been doing. I was doing this with Yavin, and this is what I'm doing now in my own lab, because we are exploring social behavior. That obviously, I'm not saying that social behavior in our rats is identical to the social behavior that we think in human, because we cannot ask our rats what they think about their social partners, for example. But we can get close to some aspect of social behavior. We can model social interaction by asking a rat, to perform a task, to open a gate and interact with another rat on the other side. Obviously, when I say social has a spectrum. It's not just one behavior. There are different parts that will create social behavior as we think about social behavior. We know that in our case, we were able to show that social behavior is protective against drug of abuse. But in reality, we know that there are other social behaviors that actually will facilitate drug use. Social peer pressure and things like that. We wanted to model one aspect of it. We wanted to model the aspect that social interaction are positive, therefore they will help you to abstain from a drug. And obviously we had to play a bit with our procedure. You need to play with the parameters to obtain this kind of behavior. Because if you make social interaction negative, for example, you give a small shock to the rat or you delay social interaction, then social interaction became negative, and this is not protective against addiction anymore. So these are different aspects that you can model in rats. And right now, what we are focusing on the lab is the other aspect of it. If you think about the social stigma against people with addiction is a real phenomenon. So people experiencing addiction tend to be more marginalized, tend to be more stigmatized. So what we are doing with our rats, we are asking the partner to perform an additional task if they want to still interact with a rat under the influence or not. Because we already know from our earlier study that a rat under the influence will seek social help, will seek social interaction. But we don't know if the partner, and in our mind, this translational idea of society, if society will help these rats to abstain. So is this rat willing to perform a task to work together or not? So far, what we are seeing is the answer is no. For the most quote-unquote addicted rats, if we can use the word addicted for a rat, for the most addicted rat, we are seeing that the partner will refuse to interact, will reject this interaction because the other rat is quote-unquote under the influence. So there are ways to do that, but we need to keep in mind that we cannot model all at once. There is not a magic model that will do everything. And as you said, at some point we need to acknowledge that our rats are not humans, or probably the humans are not rats. I'm not sure which one is best. But we
Both
can,
is good.
yeah, but we cannot do all in one animal model. We need to identify what is the part of translational work that we want to do. And then one last point that I think is the most critical one, and it's perfect for this panel. These days, you cannot create an animal model by yourself in the basement of your lab. Although I love behavior, I love to watch my rats, to train my rats. If I don't get myself exposed to different ideas, to different aspects of science, or even outside of science, I won't be able to create a relevant animal model anymore. We need to try to get out of the dogma of animal models per se, and we need to start thinking about a more holistic way to create the animal model, to back translate to the clinic and keep the discussion going. Otherwise, the animal model will be there and it will be not very useful. It will be just, for my pleasure, I develop a new animal model, but what it is for. So that's what I think.
Does anyone else want to add?
I want to ask
Go
question, follow-up question. So you're talking about stigma and people are not willing to help because of stigma. It seems quite obvious that the animals, the rats don't have stigma against each other. So not being willing to help, do you think that is because, so I know a lot less than you about rats, but I have seen that they, for instance, if they're together in a cage, they sleep, they kind of cuddle, but if one is very sick and maybe dying, I don't know if they cast that one away or it goes away on its own, but it doesn't sleep with all the rest. So is it that the more addicted they are, do you think, I mean, we don't know, but maybe you know or have data on this, that they estimate that they cannot help, that it's too far gone in some sense?
I believe so. I believe so because the experiment we are running right now are with heroin. So if you train them for several weeks on heroin, or if you use other way to get them addicted, you can see that they look, I don't want to say sick, but not as a normal rat. And we believe that the other rat is perceiving this different state. And for this reason, this interaction is not as positive as it was before. But if you ask the rat, the addicted rat, to press for social, the rat will do it. So there is a seeking for social interaction even after this drug exposure. But the problem is that from the other side, obviously we cannot talk about stigma in our rats, but from the other side, there is this kind of rejection situation. One thing we want to do now is to have the partner under the influence as well. Because could it be possible in our prediction that if the partner is under the influence, probably they will be able to still interact or willing to perform the task to interact because they can, I don't know, identify with their state, for example.
Marco, have you found an effect on the drug taking in the rat who's rejected yet?
We haven't done yet. For sure, I can tell you that this happened to the most addicted rats. If we have some middle ground, let's say, rats that are taking drug but not so compulsively, this phenomenon is not this strong. This will go back to what you were saying about David, about heterogeneity and stuff. So we need to run a lot of animal to identify those that are being rejected. And also the question is, are you rejected because of this single partner? Is another partner not going to reject you in the state? So we need to do all these iterations before we can conclude that this is the real phenomenon.
So are the rats showing individual variability in how tolerant they are towards other rats that use drugs?
In this case, yes. We are seeing that if you change the pairs, if you change the partner, you could see different things.
So summarizing, I feel like part of what you've said is that on the one hand, to make animal models relevant, there has to be a kind of broadening, right? So a looking to things which are outside of classic paradigms. But on the other hand, a precisifying, right? So the questions become smaller and really specific. And the sort of aspiration of producing a general model as opposed to understanding, say, how drug taking might be influenced in a particular animal when they're rejected socially by a conspecific becomes a much finer grained question, but one which feels then like it might have some translatability.
Yeah. And the key is to use all the animal model that we have been developing the last 50 years, because I'm not inventing anything new. I'm reusing the same thing that we have been working with. I'm just adding some of these aspects that we are discussing here. I'm still using drug self-administration. I'm still using the validity of a relapse model or the validity of an extinction session, but I'm using in a different umbrella now. Like the idea is, can I achieve something else that is not just the drug taking aspect of it?
Other comments from the panel? I am going to pause to see if anyone wants a question. It's very hard for me to see.
You can see anything from here.
Does anyone?
Oh,
yes.
there is a question.
Yes, thanks.
I have to say that it's very impressive to have my heart behind me. I was not used to it. But.
Yes, you can all, this is all Marco's art, so we must all make him face up to his brilliance as an artist, which is a... Yes, thank you.
Let's not.
Because the book would not be anything like what it is.
This is just
as beautiful
only
without
for Hanna.
these illustrations. Okay, thank you.
Hi, really interesting so far. My question is about, and I'm sorry I don't know your work well enough, and I'm also a primatologist, so I don't know enough about rats, but I was wondering whether the rats are choosing to disengage or not even participate with your addicted rat because they are an unreliable partner in whatever task they're doing, beyond just their body condition. We know in studies of cooperation that you stop cooperating with somebody that's unhelpful. I wondered, A, that, and B, if you offered your addicted rats the opportunity to choose between another addicted rat versus a quote-unquote clean rat, whether they would who they would choose, and again, if it comes back to that sort of reliability in a partner.
Well, thank you for your questions. I also don't know what I'm doing, so we are on the same page on that. So I'll start with your second question because you're giving me a bit of PTSD because I had to create my own boxes and cages to do these experiments. So your question is great. It will be great to have an additional, a second partner chamber somewhere on the other side. But it was very tough to build those boxes the first time. So the idea to build a third version of it, it makes me a bit, thinking for a second. It is a great question. It will be great to do an experiment like that. If I have to predict or say something about it, I will say that an addicted rat will choose to play with another addicted rat rather than a drug-naive rat. Although it will be interesting, it's an empirical question, it will be interesting to see that because I don't have the real answer. For your other question, so our rats are cage mates when they arrive to the facility. So they know each other for before and they stay together for a few weeks before we start the experiment. And we keep the same partner throughout the entire experiment. So they know exactly who is coming. Obviously, you can play with familiar and non-familiar rat, but we have not explored that in this rejection aspect of this. It could be that a non-familiar rat will be more keen to interact, especially at the beginning, because there is a novelty component in it, but I don't have an answer for that yet. In 6 months, give me 6 months.
Yeah, Owen.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that, the question. So I think it's a really interesting point, and I'm glad you invited it, because Yael first asked in terms of the stigma modeling. I think this is a terribly important problem because one does hear, of course, in discourse about drug use, drug abuse, addiction, isn't it unfortunate that there's so much stigma attached? And it's often said in a glib way, as if it could just go away magically, were one to recognize certain facts about the nature of addictions. But of course, one of the things that the question just invited is reflection on the fact that it may just be that certain kinds of drug use will be negatively valenced in general because it produces unreliability in social partners. I mean, there's many different kinds of stigma, but that goes back to what Yael asked you. She said, were they not playing with the conspecific because they thought it was too far gone in the way of a dying one would be? And that would be a very different cognitive affective sort of response, right? So, but I think it's a terribly interesting question how to model such things as that we think of as distinctively human, things like shame, guilt, feelings of stigma and rejection and regret and remorse. We'll want to do that if we can, and I guess maybe, well, primates are next up, but we shouldn't do that to them. So, but it's an interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, before we move on, we're going to come to a question about the subjective experience of addiction and its relevance to studying it shortly. But I wonder if we want to just sort of get on the table the kinds of things that seem very relevant to us about addiction, which really are going to pose problems in modeling in simpler animals, right? So, Owen, you just named a few. Anyone want to add anything to that list? Shame, identity. Denial is one, which I'm always curious about. I don't know if rats can be in denial, even though they can be ignorant. So you might feel like there was something that you could do to move from the role of denial in humans to a rat, even though obviously they're not going to be motivated by deep unconscious psychodynamic processes or anything like that, but they can be ignorant.
Responsibility and blame, the two words that come from your work.
Yes, they're not good at taking responsibility. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if that's the way I was thinking about it, but feeling like they have responsibility, like they need to take responsibility, being blamed by others that they are not taking responsibility, all of that. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's put just a flag in that for future. Okay, so unless another person wants to jump in quickly, I'm going to move us to the next question, which is going to go first to Yael, even though she's the sort of funny person on the stage, to answer it first. So there are two of us on the stage who are philosophers, right? Me and Owen. And we're both very scientifically engaged, but we are philosophers. And we've both written these new, quite long-winded, potentially, books on addiction that are interdisciplinary, but really aim to keep the big picture in view. And meanwhile, in 1988, there was another philosopher named Herbert Venniro who wrote a similar style of book, right? So I said earlier that Owen and my books were siblings. He's maybe a second cousin or something like that to ours. So it does seem notable that all these contributions are from philosophers, and putting aside the kind of obvious point that we often have time to write books while scientists have to win grants and run labs. I think it's an interesting question why this might be so, and what philosophy can bring to the study of science in general and addiction science in particular. And Yael, as our neuroscience critic, I know has strong views about this. So do you want to get us going on this question?
Yeah, so I'm not going to be able to answer from the philosophy side, but from the listener to a philosopher. So I first met Hanna. She gave a talk in my department. I can't even remember if the talk was billed part of, I'm in psychology and neuroscience, so I don't remember if it was a neuroscience.
It was cognitive science. I think it was in the cognitive science program,
Cog
the lunches.
Yeah, so not even psychology or neuroscience, the Cog Sci, which is its own program. And I was blown away, completely blown away, because Hanna was there talking about the disease model of addiction, and is it correct? And what is the evidence for it? What is the evidence against it? Who are the stakeholders that push this model? What do they have to gain? What do we have to gain as scientists? What do we have to gain as society? All of that. But what blew me away was I never even thought of the disease model of addiction as a model. I just thought addiction is a disease, like, period. That's how it is. That's how we study it in neuroscience. That's how we think about it to so many people. There's a whole National Institute on Drug Abuse that's basically looking at, or what I knew about it. I know I don't know all of NIDA, but the corner that I knew, which is a pretty big corner, I think, is looking to understand what is wrong with the brain, that, what does this disease cause to the brain, and what is wrong with the brain so that we could fix it. And here comes Hanna, and I'm a computational modeler, so I think about models all the time. And she says, wait, no, this is just a model. This is not the thing. And we've already talked about animal models and how to make them, truer to reality. So when I think about a model, and this came from my PhD advisor, Daphne Joel, she said, think about a model like a model in architecture, right? Like you plan if you're an architect, you're planning a building. First, when you build a model, you build it from cardboard or something like that. You do not kid yourself that this is the building, right? You can ask that model all kinds of questions. You can look at perspective, et cetera, but you're not going to try to live in it. You're not, it's clearly a model. I think in neuroscience, we sometimes forget that our models are just a model. They are not the thing, whether they're a computational model or an animal model. But then thinking about the disease as the disease idea of addiction is just a model, never even crossed my mind. And it puts the right boundaries there, because it tells you, okay, it's not completely useless, right? We can think about some things that might be altered in the brain as a result of the drugs. Like you said, cocaine makes you not hungry. I mean, that affects behavior, right? We can think of some things that affect social interactions, reliability, et cetera. But this is not going to answer all of it, and that's not where we have to stop our inquiry. And there are many important questions, like how do we help people who are addicted, or how do we think about societal, the role of society, or the role of what else do you have in life other than the drug in a cage alone in helping you get better. And all that does not fall within the disease model of addiction. So that's why I was just captivated by Hanna and stayed her friend. And was like, can I talk to you? And then, et cetera.
Yael took me to lunch.
But exactly.
I was won over immediately by the free lunch. It was wonderful.
But it really makes me think, does NIDA have a house philosopher? Does NIH in general, when we think about mental health, all of what we think about mental health is probably different levels of models and not the thing, period. We need philosophers. I feel like knowing you that we need philosophers to, it's fine to say to keep us grounded, because philosophy seems like the opposite of grounding.
I don't think it's what we're known for, really. It's like down to earth, common sense people.
But
yeah.
maybe to see that big picture, that when you're in the weeds, when you're making the boxes and thinking of the experiments, and all those experiments are so important, we forget the big, big, big picture, that maybe, a house philosopher at NIDA, the government puts so much money into National Institute of Drug Abuse, hire a philosopher too, to just keep us all honest.
I think many of us would take that job if it was there. I mean, it's interesting. I do feel there's going to be pushback and resistance. So, I mean, I want to say that your interest in that talk was incredibly meaningful, and we've had many, many wonderful conversations. But it's not always the response I get from neuroscientists who work on addiction. People can be very resistant and indeed quite angry. So, I don't know how much that comes from challenging assumptions which are deep, or how much it comes just from the way we're all in different disciplinary silos so often, and you kind of want to keep your turf so that you keep your funding or, your sense of well-being. But those conversations feel important to have, and they're hard to have. I've found them hard to have over the years with many people.
I think in general, because of how the science that we do is intertwined with the funding, right? We need the funding for the science. It distorts some of what we do and the questions that we ask, questions that we can ask, the way we frame them. So as a computational neuroscientist, computational modeler, now I study mental health, but I used to not in the beginning. But if you apply for grants at NIH, you have to say this is relevant to some health thing. So, you kind of spin a story. And NIH funds basic science too, so we know the story is kind of spun in quite far. This is basic science, I'm just trying to understand the brain. But then we might get into that cycle of mistaking that basic science story that I really wanted to understand reward processes in the brain, so I said this is related to addiction. And then I suddenly think that addiction is just the reward process in the brain and not more than that. And then we miss a lot of research that is really, really important. I mean, do not take the money away from us, but also give money to them, right? It's also important to do the science that doesn't even look at all inside the brain, because addiction is not all inside the brain. It's a societal factor as well. And if we don't do that research, because there's this fetish of if you're not looking at the brain, you're not actually a scientist, definitely not a neuroscientist. Well, I don't look at the brain anymore, and you called me a neuroscientist still. So I will hold on to that name, because I do think I study the brain, but I don't have to be recording from the brain to study the brain, because the brain causes behavior, and behavior, causes a lot of, it's related to a lot of things that we can observe without looking inside the brain. So I just think, again, I'm not saying the research that is done is not good and should not be funded, but it's not everything that needs to be done. There's a whole other domain that is getting very short thrift, getting very little funding, and maybe the key to actually helping addicts is in that research that is not being done enough.
Owen, did you want to come in? You looked like you were itching to speak.
Well, yeah, and so it's an interesting question about why, I mean, both, Hannah's view in her beautiful, beautiful, wonderful book is this view about addictions as heterogeneous and plural. And one of the things that struck us in the 2 decades that we've been talking is, one of the advantages of being a philosopher, besides the big bucks, is that we actually aren't committed to any particular kind of causal explanations of phenomenon. So I grew up in the Boston area I was in graduate school and then stayed on to teach in the Boston area in the late 70s and early 80s. And in those days, if you were studying mind, everybody knew this hexagon, I think it was, from the Sloan Foundation. And it said, to understand mind, you have to do psychology, anthropology, linguistics, computational neuroscience. Well, that probably didn't exist then, but neuroscience. But it was just taken for granted that this project of understanding mind in all its extraordinary, glorious, and both the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, all the sides of mind were going to have to be involving multiple sciences that attend to psychological phenomena. And that was just so taken for granted. So when I got to studying about addiction, I was struck by the consistency with which, if I read a neuroscientist, they're going to say, not because they have to, but they're going to say, addiction is a brain disease. But what they really intend, to interpret it charitably, is I study the brain stuff in this extraordinarily difficult phenomenon. I'm not studying the anthropology of addiction, about which there's extraordinarily interesting work. I'm not studying the sociology of addiction, about which there's extraordinary work. About social contagion of addictions, because there's extraordinary work. But you go over to the anthropologists and they say, oh, this is a sociological or anthropological problem. So one just needs to take, I love the way Yael put it, these are different models, and for good reasons having to do with the intellectual division of labor, people take the part of nature that they're good at describing by their empirical and methods. But the whole picture has got to be, for something as complicated as addiction, it's pretty clear it's a psychobiological, social, behavioral disorder. And, but I think because we philosophers just are not committed to any particular sort of type of causal explanation, we just want the whole theory to emerge. And that's why we don't seek funds too often.
No one funds us, no.
Hanna,
Yeah.
do we have time for you to tell the Gosling story?
You want me to tell the Gosling?
Yes.
This is your favorite story. Are you sure you want me to tell it?
Yes,
Okay.
because I heard it from you.
Okay. So this is one of the things that I think is really important in trying to push back against the brain disease model is to recognize that neuroscience and cognitive science might be very illuminative of addiction, even if it's not a brain disease. Because in general, we think neuroscience and cognitive science are illuminative of human minds and human behavior, irrespective of whether those minds and behavior are diseased. So it's not the case that we need to be committed to addiction being a brain disease to think that neuroscience and cognitive science have a lot to teach. And the story that Yael loves so much is a story to show that sometimes...
It's in the book.
It's in the book.
But
it's
if you
not
haven't
mine.
read the book yet.
I take it from Jerry Wakefield, who I believe is its creator, in some articles he published on addiction around 10 years ago. And so Jerry Wakefield asks you to imagine a gosling, and goslings, as you probably know, imprint on the first thing that they see within certain parameters when they're born. But this gosling has the bad luck of seeing not a nurturing mother goose, but a fox. So imprints on the fox and follows it around until it gets eaten. And the sort of moral of this story is the thought that, well, obviously this was really bad for the gosling, but nothing was going on that was wrong in its brain, right? The brain was working exactly as it should, and yet the outcome was problematic because the imprinting mechanism is selected for in a particular kind of evolutionary environment, and you can't guarantee the existence of that environment in the here and now. And so there's a mismatch in some sense between what the brain was selected for and then what the current environment offers, and the brain may be working right, and yet when we think about the animal, something bad happens. And so this is a sort of way of thinking about addiction, which has become known as the mismatch model, where you think that actually many of the ways in which the brain is responding to drugs when we have people who are addicted is exactly how the brain ought to be responding to those kinds of rewards. We're just in a context where they're available, they're potent, there's not the kind of support or protections that another context might have had, so that you end up spiraling lower and lower. So here the explanation is really not something's wrong with the brain, it's that a mismatch occurs between a naturally functioning brain and the environment in which it's currently placed. So that's the story. Do you want to comment on it now?
Well, the reason I love that story so much is because on the one hand, it casts the question of what is wrong with the brain in addiction as maybe nothing.
Right, maybe nothing.
Whoa, maybe nothing. That doesn't mean we don't want to understand how the brain works in an environment where drugs are so available, where there is stigma, where the environment where you might imprint on a fox and do something that is very counter to your own well-being, which we see in addiction, that people do things that are counter to their own well-being, can get them eaten by the fox in the end. So we do need to understand the brain. Just the question of what goes wrong, what is wrong with that person's brain is the wrong question, or and that also the stigmatizing part. Nothing is wrong with your brain. Your brain is just like my brain. You were in a different environment than I was, and so you might have ended up addicted and I'm not, but nothing is wrong with your brain is kind of an amazing answer to that question.
Yeah, so as is coming out, I think I'm slightly more critical than Owen is in ways of the brain disease model, partially because I worry about the way it essentializes and stigmatizes. So Owen has always been very charitable to neuroscientists, while I think my relationship has been more edgy. Some of them are my best friends, some of them are not, I guess. But I think those themes are very important, themes of the way diseases are stigmatizing. There was something slightly naive about thinking that a brain disease model would reduce stigma, if you think of how associated with stigma many, many diseases are. And so there's a way in which that model can be used to essentialize, to stigmatize, and also to reduce people's ability to think they can get better, because it reduces their sense of agency. David, I feel like you've been dying to come in, so I'm going to turn to you now, and then we'll move on to the next question.
I have a tendency either to talk not enough or too much, so here comes the beginning of the too much. And I know, Hannah, you've wanted me to speak about heterogeneity in addiction, yes. And in keeping with that, as you know, my take on on addiction as a brain disease is sometimes it is, sometimes it ain't. For some people, that's the level on which to look and to intervene and explain, and for others, not so much. And I have a few words of praise for both Yael and Marco. As someone who's been at NIH since 1998, I think the culture of addiction science at NIH and NIDA, and the culture that sort of trickles out and down from there to the rest of addiction science, is improving. And what used to frustrate me is, Yael, you wrote one of the best papers I've ever read about the sort of prioritization of circuit level, brain neurocircuit level explanations of behavior over just paying serious attention to the behavior itself. I think that really is getting better, and Marco is among the animal researchers who's leading the way on that. By the way, I can't. Hannah earlier had been talking about Marco's experiments as if I had done them. I wasn't in the room at all at the time. I was brought in later as an intellectual collaborator to say, okay, here's what I think this could mean in human terms. What had been frustrating me for a long time at NIDA and NIH in general was that behavior was seen as something to sort of skip past as quickly as you could so that you could study its neural basis. So that if you had a model in which a rat was doing anything that had anything to do with drugs, for example, being alone in a cage and escalating its intake of cocaine, you would say, all right, I have a cocaine-addicted rat. Here's cocaine use disorder. I will now delve into the neurocircuitry and the genomics and the proteomics of that with a lot of whiz-bang technology that will get you published in journals like Cell and Science and Neuron. And you haven't taken the time to stop and ask exactly which aspects, if any, of addiction am I modeling? What does the behavior mean? And Marco is among the neuroscientists and behavioral scientists who have taken the time to say, okay, wait, let's look more closely at the behavior. Let's set up more complex behavioral situations, and then let's interpret the rat's behavior more complexly than we did, and let's understand the behavior as fully as we can before we start diving into the neurocircuitry of it. And that's getting better and better, I think, at NIDA and NIH, and I'm pleased with the way that you've helped to lead that change.
This doesn't mean that Marco is a smart person. Probably the opposite. So going back to one last thing, I know that you want to move on. I agree with everything we are saying here, but also we need to understand that we have done 20, 30 years of the same thing over and over. The change, by definition, is not going to be immediate. We are trying to say something that for people has been like the dogma has been the central hypothesis and everything like that. So personally, I'm not the most patient person out there. I tend to have everything done immediate and things like that. So even coming for me is very difficult. But what I'm trying to say is that it's true. It's time to get people from different background, people from different ideology in the same room. But I think we are starting it. We are just having the weight of the time. We want this to happen yesterday. And obviously it's not happening with that speed. But finally, we are finding a way to do it. And this panel is a great demonstration of it could be done. We can go to a meeting and suggest a panel like this with something that is not usual or the same talks that you are expecting. And I think over time, people will start thinking differently. But in my opinion, it will take some time.
Are you canceling us to be patient? That's so out of character.
I cannot do.
I
didn't say that. I cannot say that.
Yeah,
It's
no,
against my nature. I think there is a question over there.
Yes.
Hi, I'm just a little bit surprised by some of what I'm hearing, and this comment might sound a bit unkind, and I apologize for that up front because I'm tremendously impressed by Hanna and her work and the work all of you do. But the disease model of addiction has been not just challenged, but to my mind, all but refuted for 50 years by, and not by philosophers. I'm not aware philosophers were writing about addiction until Fingeret. Maybe I'm mistaken, but social scientists produced a lot of literature, and I can think of examples that showed why the data just doesn't support the idea that all of addiction can be understood by looking at brains. And I don't think Hanna would pretend that she's the first to question and challenge and undermine the disease model among philosophers and a lot of social scientists. It has really been challenged or rejected for even decades.
Can I respond to that one? I'm happy to respond to that one. I think it's a great question. The question is, we've known this is false for ages. Why are we still cleaving to it? And I guess one question about that is who's the we, right? So I think so far we've talked mainly about neuroscientists, and part of the reason for cleaving no doubt has to do with having made a career using that model, the way you can only get funding. I mean, I really believe this to be true. There are young neuroscientists I know in the audience, they will not get funded unless they sign up to the model if they want to work on addiction. So there are real incentive structures within neuroscience which keep us there. But then there's another interpretation of the we, which is we as a society, we as a public, we as people. And here I think the reasons are different, and they have not just to do with the fact, which no doubt is true, that intellectual ideas don't always make it in digestible forms into the public realm. I mean, no doubt that's part of it. But I also think that there's a way in which the brain disease model is a really important idea for many people as they negotiate their own addiction and perhaps try to live with somebody else who is addicted, and it functions sometimes to help people feel like they have an understanding and they know what to do. And giving that up is terrifying and can be really painful. So I think there's a way that the connection to the brain disease model, in ways in which it allows us a very black and white understanding of responsibility and blame and morality and what we can expect of ourselves and each other, can be part of the reason why, in this broader sense of we, it's been cleaved to so fiercely, because without another way of thinking about yourself and your own relationships with drugs and your own relationships with other people, giving it up can feel very terrifying and like you could fall back into use. So I think it's an amazing question. The answer, I think, is going to be incredibly complex. That was Doug Cusack, by the way, for people who don't know. Thank you, Doug. Marco, yeah. And then I'm going to move us on to one more question.
I think this is a great question, and I agree with you that the brain disease has been challenged, and a lot of people are doing work against it or not. The question is why we are still not moving on. In my mind, I think we should learn how to fail faster. We know that something is not working, and we publish papers, but in reality, we collect data for years, and then we publish just a part of it. As scientists, we learn to accept that something is not working, and we put it in a folder, a very big folder of failed experiments. And this is the same thing that we are facing here. It has been 20 years, the model has been challenged, but not a new thing is coming in to take over or to say, let's try something different, which is something that we are doing here. So probably the lesson here should be, let's try to fail faster and move on with the next thing that we have to do. But I could be wrong on that.
David, can I invite you to say the thing you always say about heterogeneity?
What do I always say?
What do you always say? So David has this great line, which is that just because it does not follow from acknowledging that other people might be right, that you're wrong.
Yeah.
So I was inviting you to speak to that,
Yeah.
and the way in which some of the problem, some of what needs to happen is a paradigm or a way of marrying different views together.
Yeah,
right.
I've been walked out on angrily for suggesting in a talk that sometimes addiction isn't a brain disease. It would completely my life, I suppose, if I were now walked out on angrily for suggesting sometimes it is. But that is my. But what do we even mean by addiction as a brain disease? I think that's really more like a maxim or a credo than a theory. It doesn't make specific, testable, falsifiable predictions. But if what we mean by addiction as a brain disease is that in some cases, for some people, addiction is best understood at a neural level and best intervened with by biomedical interventions, be it a medication or, I don't know, TMS, deep brain stimulation, that nothing else will work, nothing behavioral or contextual or psychological will work, and that there has to be a biomedical intervention. I think that is true or can be true in some cases, and that doesn't do anything to take away from the many cases in which the explanation and the type of intervention you need to do is something other than that. So I'm always, I guess I've learned not to be surprised now, but by how angry people can become when I say everybody can be right for some cases in some times. I was going to say something else and I forget what it was. So maybe I'll remember it later.
It's okay. Let's have one last question and then we'll stop. So I'm going to take us back to the subjective experience of living with addiction, right? So we've talked a lot about the brain disease so far, but that's something which actually all three of the philosophy books we've talked about, Fingeret's as well, but definitely Owen's and mine, really foreground is the way in which there's so much to learn by listening to what people say about their own lived experience with addiction. And, I think that kind of message is something which is more present in the social sciences. Certainly it's more present in bioethics or public health or anthropology. I think more mainstream addiction science is starting to recognize its importance, but it's not sort of quite as well enmeshed, right, in how most sort of addiction neuroscientists or cognitive scientists are thinking about addiction. But it does really raise this general question, which is like, how important should it be, right? How much ought we to be trying to do justice to first-person experience and testimony? And also, relatedly, is it true that we could model that appropriately in animals, right? Is there any possibility of modeling human addictive experience, not just behavior, in animals like rats? So, Owen, I'd like you to start us off on this one.
So yeah, thank you very much. So in my work, some of you know, I am an addict, or was an addict, as I tend to say. For 20 years on and off, I was alcoholic and used benzodiazepines, even more than alcohol. I've tried most everything, and not everything, but almost everything at some time or another. And I haven't used alcohol or benzodiazepines for 19 years. Because of my history, and because I was a philosopher of mind, also interested in ethics, I thought, well, I'm sort of fairly well positioned. Plus, I had a career that was successful. So I was what people are surprised sometimes. They'll say, "You were what?" And I say, "Yeah, it's not that hard. It's not that hard." I was a summa cum laude in drinking, walking up to the bar and staying there. But one of the things that so one of the ideas that in my own work is that besides, of course, taking the objective third personal view of science and trying to understand ourselves from the objective scientific point of view, there is the question of what is it like to be an addict? If there is any single thing it is like to be an addict, and my answer to that is there isn't any single thing it is like to be an addict or a drug abuser, and just sticking with substances for now. And one reason for that is something that Hanna and I both emphasize in our work, is right out of the gate, just sticking with substance addictions, different substances have normally different phenomenological effects on people. Okay, so my first drink when I was 12, had a little glass of hard cider that my friend had. I walked home, and that day I felt the world had changed. I wasn't high or drunk or anything. I just felt safe and not scared. I wouldn't have said I was scared and not safe person. I actually had a happy house. I went home to so that was that day, and boy, I liked that feeling. That was a check. I checked that one. I've tried other drugs that I just don't like. Amphetamines just don't do anything for me. Everybody in my family, pot makes them paranoid. Not me, I love it. No paranoia. So different drugs we go to for different phenomenological fields. And in terms of also causal history, I mean, just briefly. So I grew up, again, in a family that was, I'm the oldest of 6 children. Everyday dad, a very successful businessman, would come home from Manhattan, and there would be cocktail hour in my house. And 2 martinis. And when I was 18, I was a drinking age in New York. I got to bake martinis with Dad. And I now know the recipe. The recipe would make you well above the drinking limit for cars. I think it's 0.08, something like that, blood alcohol. It would take you, 2 of those would take you up there. But that was a ritual that was actually thrilling for me. I loved when Dad came home. It was exciting. It was family. We all got to talk about his day. We sat down for a collective dinner. But I wanted to be the kid who had cocktail hour one day. And so it was a perfectly sort of normal sort of cultural trajectory. Now that's very different from, for example, some old good work from the 1960s. I think Jelinek was maybe 60s. He talks about different cultural styles. So for example, French agricultural workers, especially ones working in the vineyards, usually drink all day long. They never go above 0.08, okay? But it's 12 hours or 16 hours a day. So this is just a completely different form of habit formation that's completely taken for granted and embedded in the culture. Now that's a different etiology than getting addicted to methamphetamine in Iowa because you're an agricultural worker and people say, take this stuff, this will really get you going. Or I live in Maine for half the year. Maine fishermen who, along with the coal miners in Kentucky, who have back injuries. Every one of them has a back injury, and someone says, here, we have OxyContin for you. Okay, so these are different drugs with different phenomenological effects and different strategies. The other thing, just in those that show about social scaffolding, I think that one of the other areas in which things are quite heterogeneous is, and I'm interested, I mean, some of what Marco and has been talking about does seem to me to be things one could model. But like last week in the Times, there were two really powerful articles within a day of each other. Well, one was in the Wall Street Journal, one was in the Times. The one in the Wall Street Journal was about addicts now in Philadelphia who are taking yet another new sedative, and which makes them fall asleep immediately after their fentanyl, which they're already addicted to. And they fall asleep on the streets. Now, they're now addicted to two drugs, so they're having to, and they're two entirely different drugs with entirely different causal properties. One's a sedative, and the other one is fentanyl. And Narcan doesn't work to revive these people from sleep, and it's just a tragedy. But this is just occurring in a little ecology, and that's an entirely different etiology to, well, in this case, a second addiction at least. There was another article about how smoking is coming back among graduate students in areas like comparative literature and philosophy, because it's so,
Because we're
I mean,
cool.
vaping is so industrialized and sort of weird, and so if you want to be edgy and nihilistic, and now, you know, and so on and so forth, and furthermore, you get over your phone addiction by rolling a cigarette with someone else. So these social phenomena here are just sort of really important. The other thing I'll say, and just two quick things. One is in response to Doug's question about disease. I actually, with respect to the debates about the brain disease model versus the moral model, I don't talk about it. I actually am following a strategy of extinction. I'm serious about this. I tried not to bring it up. I understand everybody brings it up, but, and what I will say, one of the things that I think Addicts' Voices adds, so this is because I'm not only talking about my view as an addict, but I talk thousands and thousands of friends I've talked to, because I've been in meetings all over the world trying to get people to help me in Narcotics Anonymous, in Alcoholics Anonymous. And what I will say is that in those rooms, addicts will sometimes say that their addictions are a disease, but they just as often will they'll say, it's a disease. I don't know if it's a brain disease. But sometimes they'll just say it's a disorder. I prefer the word disorder. In the literature, you'll see dysfunction, disorder, syndrome, and disease. And some people think it's a metabolic disease, not a brain disease. So, you know, you could be, so I'm again, lately, not fussing too much about those designations. Usually addicts think it's not good for them, their life is not going well. They liked it at the beginning, or we often did, and then it's not going too well. So the disease that people will compare it to among addicts is type 2 diabetes. And the reason they'll do that, I think, and this is important, one of the other pieces of testimony you get from addicts, a lot of people say, well, the best part about treating addiction as a disease is then the poor addicts won't feel responsible. But when we get together, we feel responsible. We feel ashamed and guilty. And we are trying to leverage our own agency to sort of get our way out of this. So I think if you listen to the testimony of addicts, you can't tell us that we're not responsible. We're hoping, crossing our fingers, that we figure our way out. We want help in leveraging it, whether it's in the social environment, whether it's by you showing, or by me revealing to you that I'm not as unreliable as I now seem to be, hopefully, cross my fingers, maybe. That's one of the struggles. So I think this is, you know, distinctively human problems of dislocation can cause addictions. But very nice rituals like a cocktail hour that's part of a culture can cause addiction. So the heterogeneous causal roots, I think it just helps win Hanna's view.
Yeah, and by the way, of course, we're here to talk about Hanna's book, but Owen, your book, What Is It Like to Be an Addict, is the other great book that's come out recently about addiction. And I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth by saying this, but one thing I loved about it was its embrace of a plurality of explanations for addiction, a plurality of ideas about what addiction can be and mean and what to do about it.
Final question from the audience? Yes. Travis.
Hi. Congratulations, Hannah. And thanks for bringing this all together, which is great fun for us. So I have a question related to this ongoing conversation about the heterogeneity of addiction. And it's about whether you can like lump types of addiction, especially with reference to where the brain disease model makes more versus less sense. And so one thing that I've heard people talk about is that it really sort of makes the most sense in the case where you have significant psychological comorbidities, like with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, that at this point it starts to feel like, Maya Salovitz talked about like broken brain is so insulting because like that's just not the way we should be thinking about it. But then you talk to some folks who are like, medication is the only thing that will help me because it's so mixed up with so many other things that are going wrong in my brain. And that feels like quite a different model from the one that starts with cocktail hour, that gives you this like really rich sense of ritual and history. So I just wondered if some of you that have thought a lot about heterogeneity have anything to say about if there's like a lumping in this way where the disease model makes more sense. Thanks.
Yes. Do you want to go first? You start, David.
No, I mean, I think in some ways I've already stood on this soapbox, so I'm just going to say yes. I think yes, there's a time to lump and a time to split, to put it ecclesiastically, and we don't, I don't yet know exactly where the lumpings and splittings should occur when we talk about addiction, but I think we have to learn where and when to do both. That's all I want to say right now about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And just for the audience's sake, about 40 to 50% of people with addictions are thought to have a comorbid psychological problem, anything from simple anxiety to depressions to schizophrenia, et cetera. And there are high rates, even with people with ADHD, for example, there's high rates of addiction. But so it's an interesting question. I guess I think that most medical professionals who I know treat these other mental disorders as sort of perfect, fertile ground for reasons to use, or everything from imprudence to other reasons to use, or to actually affect one's psychological, tone down or tune up psychological states. But I would think of them, I think most people think of them as having different etiologies, the addiction part and the other parts. Yesterday, by the way, in terms of typologies, I think it was in Nature, I just downloaded this article, I haven't read it yet, but it's saying that mental disorders could be categorized in terms of 5 different types. I don't know if people saw this yesterday, but the types were all, it's genomics. So in other words, there you might get the thing that people say, this article just assumes that mental illnesses are genetic disorders. And of course, there are people who still want to, there are interesting genetic connections with all these things, we know that. But I think it's back to what Yael said about models. The geneticists, of course, are going to be looking at the level of genes for divvying these things up. The psychologists are going to be looking at the level of psychological states and behavior for looking, and then neuroscience is going to be looking at the brain stuff. Anyway, those are just some thoughts on your nice question. Thank you.
I'm going to make some final remarks and then draw this to a close just in relation to that question. I think, so one of the things that strikes me about the question is that on the one hand, we really want to pay attention to individuals, right, and the differences, but then also we're looking for generalizations, right? We're looking for ways to understand that collect people together and allow some kind of predictive and potentially interventional help, right? And there's a tension there, right? There's just a tension between those aims. The second thing is that the lumping shouldn't just be about brain, is sort of the neurobiological level of explanation and potentially pathology, one category, and then there's everything else, right? So again, that's kind of like dragging us back as if that's the real question. Is it a brain disease or isn't it? And the thought, I think, really ought to be, in some cases, that's a really, really helpful place to go. In many other cases, it isn't, and there's huge variety there. So it's not as if there's not a good cleavage here between brain disease and the rest, because there's so much refinement we need to do, potentially both within neurobiology, but also within all of the explanations, which really are going to be at a psychological or social level. And I think the last thing, which I guess, in some sense for me, I feel this is really important, just coming out of reflecting on my own clinical history, where I worked with people with substance use disorder within a personality disorder clinic, so there was always comorbidity, is that comorbidity was the last indicator in the world that we ought to think of this as a brain disease and a place to intervene neurobiologically. In fact, the opposite, because most people with comorbidities, at least in our clinic and in my experience, are using drugs as a way to manage psychiatric symptoms. This is Edward Consian's self-medication hypothesis, which, even if you disagree with some of the details, I think all of us recognize as, in outline true. People use drugs to cope with suffering, and people with mental disorders live with terrible suffering, and drugs are often a go-to way of handling that. So there, in a certain sense, you have the exact opposite of a neurobiological explanation of addiction. The use of drugs here is it's a coping mechanism which is rational and responsive to a need, and the way you address it is to identify what's going on in the person and help them learn a different way to cope. So I guess I just feel that's really important to say, because somehow if we don't kind of get that on the table, then all of a sudden the people who have mental disorders are the people who have, all and only the people who have something wrong with their brain. And there's a lot of stigma around that, and I just think it's false. That's not how it lumps, even if it's still true that there are some people where the neurobiological level is the right place to look. So we have to move on. I'm so sorry, I've taken the last word very rudely. But I want to thank the panelists before asking them to leave the stage for a wonderful conversation. Thank you all.